Emotional neglect is difficult to talk about because it doesn't always look dramatic. There may have been no shouting, no obvious cruelty, and no single moment you can point to and say, that's when everything broke. Instead, emotional neglect is defined by what wasn't there. The comfort you didn't receive, the curiosity about your feelings that never came, the sense that your inner world mattered to someone else. And because nothing bad seemed to happen, many people grow up believing they weren't harmed at all until they enter adult relationships and begin to notice patterns they can't explain. Today, we're talking about how emotional neglect quietly shapes the way you love, attach, and show up in adult relationships. Dear Heart, this isn't about blaming the past. It's about finally understanding yourself with clarity and compassion. What emotional neglect really is. Emotional neglect isn't about abuse, it's about absence. It happens when your emotional needs weren't consistently noticed, validated, or responded to. When you were fed, clothed, and cared for physically, but emotionally left to figure things out on your own. You may have learned early on that expressing emotions didn't lead to comfort, that being upset didn't change anything, that needing reassurance was inconvenient or ignored. So you adapted. Not by becoming dramatic, but by becoming quiet, self-contained, and emotionally independent. The problem is those adaptations don't disappear in adulthood, they follow you into love. Why emotional neglect is hard to identify. One of the most confusing things about emotional neglect is that many people don't realize it happened to them. You might think my childhood was fine, or others had it worse, or nothing bad really happened. But emotional neglect doesn't leave obvious scars, it leaves uncertainty, self-doubt, difficulty identifying your own needs. You may struggle to answer simple questions like, what do I feel, what do I need, what do I want from this relationship? Not because you're disconnected, but because no one helped you build that emotional language growing up. How emotional neglect shows up in adult love. In adult relationships, emotional neglect often shows up indirectly. You might crave closeness but feel uncomfortable when it actually arrives. You may want intimacy yet feel overwhelmed when someone tries to understand you deeply. This can create a confusing push-pull dynamic. You long to be seen, but once someone really looks at you, you instinctively pull back. Vulnerability feels unfamiliar, not comforting. Not because you don't care, but because emotional closeness wasn't something you learned to trust. Difficulty expressing needs. One of the clearest signs of emotional neglect in adult love is difficulty expressing needs. You may minimize what you want. You might tell yourself you're asking for too much or convince yourself that your feelings aren't that important. Instead of saying what you need, you wait and hope the other person notices. And when they don't, you feel hurt, disappointed, or quietly resentful. This isn't manipulation, it's conditioning. If no one responded to your needs growing up, it makes sense that asking now feels unsafe or pointless. Attraction to emotionally unavailable partners. Many people who experienced emotional neglect find themselves drawn to emotionally unavailable partners. Not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. There's something oddly comfortable about chasing connection rather than receiving it, about trying to earn love rather than simply being loved. Emotionally unavailable partners reinforce the belief you learned early on, that love requires effort, patience, and self-silencing. When someone is emotionally present, it may even feel suspicious or overwhelming because your nervous system isn't used to that level of attunement. Struggling to feel enough in love. Emotional neglect often creates a quiet sense of inadequacy. You may feel like you're hard to love, too much, or secretly not enough, even when there's no evidence to support those beliefs. You might overthink your words, monitor your behavior, or worry about being abandoned if you express the wrong emotion. Love doesn't feel secure, it feels conditional. And so you stay emotionally careful, even with people who care about you. Emotional self-reliance in relationships. Another common pattern is emotional self-reliance. You may pride yourself on not needing much from your partner. You handle your emotions alone, you don't lean too heavily, you don't ask for reassurance. On the surface, this looks like strength. But underneath, it can be a learned response to emotional neglect. a belief that relying on others is disappointing or unsafe. You learned early that comfort came from within, not because you wanted it that way, but because you had no other choice. Why conflict feels so threatening? For many people shaped by emotional neglect, conflict feels disproportionately intense. Not because you can't handle disagreement, but because emotional rupture once meant emotional abandonment. When conflict arises, your body may react with shutdown, anxiety, or the urge to withdraw. You may struggle to express hurt in the moment or feel overwhelmed by strong emotions. You're not being dramatic. Your nervous system is reacting to old patterns where emotional disconnection felt permanent. The core wound emotional neglect leaves behind. At its core, emotional neglect teaches one painful lesson: your inner world doesn't matter. That belief doesn't disappear on its own. It quietly influences how much space you take up in relationships, how much love you allow yourself to receive, and how safe you feel being fully known. You may doubt whether your feelings are valid, you may second-guess your emotional responses, you may struggle to trust your own needs. Not because you're broken, but because no one mirrored them back to you consistently. How healing begins. Healing from emotional neglect isn't about blaming caregivers or rewriting the past. It's about finally giving yourself what was missing. It begins with learning to notice your emotions without dismissing them, with practicing naming what you feel, with allowing yourself to want things even if asking feels uncomfortable at first. Healing also involves choosing relationships that feel emotionally safe even if they feel unfamiliar. Relationships where communication is encouraged, not avoided, where your feelings are met with curiosity rather than dismissal. This work takes time, and it's okay if it feels awkward at first. You're learning a language you were never taught. A gentle reflection. Ask yourself this gently. Do I feel safe expressing my emotions in love, or do I feel like I need to manage them to be accepted? There's no right or wrong answer, only awareness. And awareness is where change begins. Dear heart, emotional neglect doesn't mean you were unloved, it means you were emotionally unseen. And that absence shaped how you learned to love. But you are allowed to learn something new now. You are allowed to take up emotional space. You are allowed to want connection that feels warm, responsive, and steady. Nothing is wrong with the way you learn to survive, and nothing is wrong with wanting more now. If this resonated with you, like the video, share it with someone who may need these words, and subscribe to Dear Heart for more conversations about psychology, healing, and emotional truth. Your emotions matter, and you deserve to be met in love.